The invitation had arrived unexpectedly, nestled between my morning paper and a drab advertisement for lawn seed. Greystone Hall, the embossed card read, at the pleasure of Sir Alistair Hemmings. I had not seen Alistair in years, not since the war, when he had briefly served in a logistical post and had once commandeered my boots by mistake. Now, apparently, he had taken to hosting weekend gatherings at his country estate in Kent. Grand affairs, I was told, for those whose lives had become quieter, but not necessarily duller. It was on the encouragement of an old mutual acquaintance, a certain Colonel Bramsley, that I accepted. Greystone Hall stood imposingly against the fading autumn light, ivy-strangled and proud, with a gravel drive that crunched with old secrets. It was a place of generations, the kind of house that had watched its share of whispered scandals and quiet arrangements. We were 7 guests in total, not counting the household staff. There was Lady Evelyn, the second wife, regal in posture, and cool in speech. Marcus, the son, sharp-eyed and brisk, whose handshake felt like a test. Lillian, the daughter, a pale and distant figure with the distracted manner of a woman nursing invisible wounds. Professor Ewan Carrow, a florid-faced botanist with a deep voice and a laugh that overstayed its welcome. Mrs. Daphne Crane, a widow of some charm and much elegance, and finally Mr. Sims, the secretary, a man of pinched features and darting eyes who seemed to fold himself into corners like a shadow that hadn't yet decided to stay. Dinner that. Evening was served in the formal dining room beneath a chandelier of ancient crystals. It was an affair of heavy silver, creaking butlers, and a roast that demanded both attention and dental fortitude. Sir Alistair presided with a leonine air, voice still strong, his face drawn but alert. He spoke of politics with biting disdain, of property taxes with theatrical despair, and of family matters with a wryness that veiled something unspoken. Every so often he would glance toward Lillian with something between regret and expectation. She never met his eye. It was after the port had been passed and the cheese barely touched that it happened. Sir Alistair raised his glass. To enduring houses and enduring names, he said, a toast met with hesitant laughter, and then, quite without drama, his hand trembled, and the glass dropped to the carpeted floor with a soft thud. He did not gasp or cry out. He simply sat back in his chair, blinked once as if puzzled, and went quite still. A silence fell over the room, heavy as the velvet curtains. Lady Evelyn's spoon clattered against her plate. Mr. Sims rose at once and rushed to his employer's side. "Sir Alistair?" he said, voice thinning with each syllable. But Sir Alistair did not respond. A doctor from the village, summoned with alarming speed, arrived in less than a quarter hour. He examined the body with practiced hands and a grimace that grew only deeper. "No sign of trauma," he muttered. "No swelling of the throat, pulse stopped clean. It's as if something simply turned him off." Later, as we gathered in the drawing room, each guest gripped by a particular variety of shock, I could not help but notice how oddly composed some seemed. Marcus stood by the hearth, one arm behind his back, staring into the flames with an intensity that suggested calculation, not grief. Lillian sat rigidly, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the corner of the carpet where the glass had fallen. The port had left a faint stain. Mrs. Crane murmured something to Lady Evelyn, who nodded absently, her expression unreadable. Mr. Sims paced by the window, occasionally peering out as though expecting someone to arrive or flee. It was then that I penned a brief letter to Poirot. "My dear Poirot," I wrote, "I find myself once again drawn into circumstances that defy plain sense. A man has died without wound, without cry, and seemingly without cause. No mark, no trace, no poison, say the doctor. Yet there was a look in Sir Alistair's eye, something of triumph, perhaps, or irony. I'm inclined to think it was a death not unforeseen by him." There was a port glass in his hand and a smirk. The letter was posted before midnight. I retired to bed, unsettled. Morning brought with it grey skies and a quiet that felt forced. The house seemed aware of its loss. Breakfast was a sparse affair. Only 3 of the guests appeared. Lady Evelyn claimed illness, Lillian refused to leave her room, and Sims, I was told, had taken to reviewing Sir Alistair's papers. Marcus buttered his toast with the air of a man completing a business transaction. The constable who had arrived at dawn was polite, but resigned. "Old age," he told me. "These sorts of collapses aren't so rare, especially after a heavy meal." But there was something gnawing at me. The ease of the death, the absence of signs, the stain on the carpet, the curious way Lillian had stared at it, and the faintest hint, barely perceptible but there, of a floral scent in the dining room after we had left. I assumed it must have been the roses, yet there had been none. By late afternoon, a motor car pulled into the drive. I recognized the hat, the coat, the glint of patent leather shoes even before he stepped out. Poirot had come. He took in the house, the sky, and the air with that particular narrowing of his eyes that meant his mind was already assembling details. He turned to me with a faint, amused expression. "Mon cher Hastings," he said, adjusting his gloves, "you write of death without sign. Then we must look not for what is present, but what is missing." As we stepped inside, I had the sense that the quiet at Greystone Hall would not remain so for long. Poirot was on the case, and someone somewhere in this house would soon learn that even a death without trace leaves behind something. The moment Poirot stepped over the threshold of Greystone Hall, the house seemed to recoil, not in any literal sense, of course, but with that subtle, imperceptible tension that attends the arrival of a man who sees too much and says too little. The butler, a dignified figure named Kersey, had barely welcomed him before Poirot's eyes swept the vestibule. With quiet precision, his fingers briefly brushed the brass doorknob, then his gaze paused on a faint smudge upon the banister, something no one else had thought worth seeing. "Mon ami," he murmured, as I helped him off with his coat, "you will observe the dust. She is disturbed only in certain places. And always," he added, pointing delicately with one gloved finger, "by the right hand." We were shown into the morning room where Lady Evelyn awaited us. She rose with careful poise, her widow's black worn not with sorrow, but a certain pride, as though she had long rehearsed this performance. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a gloved hand, "it was very kind of you to come so swiftly. Colonel Bramsley speaks highly of you." Poirot bowed slightly. "When a man dies suddenly and without visible cause, madame, it is not kindness that brings me, but curiosity." A flicker passed across her expression, too quick to name, too faint to pursue. The morning room bore the trappings of polite grief. Drapes partially drawn, a tray of untouched tea things, a copy of the Times folded but not read. The air smelt faintly of lavender water and old paper. Lady Evelyn answered questions readily, perhaps too readily. Yes, Sir Alistair had been in good spirits. No, he had not complained of illness. He had taken his usual port, nothing more. No, she could not recall anyone acting strangely at dinner. "But," she added, lowering her voice, "Lillian has been withdrawn, more than usual. I fear the strain has affected her deeply." Poirot inclined his head, but said nothing. He wandered briefly to the tea tray, lifted the lid of the sugar bowl, and peered inside as if the answer to Sir Alistair's death might be hiding behind the lumps. As we moved into the hallway, Sims, the secretary, appeared with a start, nearly dropping the folder he carried. He was a wiry man with narrow shoulders, and the manner of someone who had learned to disappear in plain sight. "Ah, Monsieur Sims," Poirot said, with a smile that was too pleasant to be comfortable. "You are the man who knew Sir Alistair's mind best, perhaps. A secretary always knows." I did my duty, sir," Sims replied, glancing quickly to me, then away. "I organized his papers, arranged correspondence. He was particular." "About order," Poirot nodded solemnly. "As am I." He stepped closer. "Did he receive any letter recently? Any that disturbed him?" Sims hesitated. "There was something from a solicitor 3 days ago. A matter of land titles, I believe." He seemed agitated after reading it. "And this letter, it is where?" "In his study, sir. I was about to file it." Poirot waved a hand. Later, the papers do not go anywhere. But the moments after death, they vanish like the mist." We passed through the main hall where Marcus stood by the window, staring out across the gardens. He turned as we approached, jaw tightening ever so slightly at the sight of Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said flatly, "I suppose now every drawer will be turned out and every word scrutinized?" "Not every word," Poirot replied. "Only the ones spoken to deceive." Marcus gave a mirthless smile. "Good luck with that. My father deceived more in silence than in speech." "Ah," Poirot said, nodding. "But silence, it too is a language." We continued toward the dining room, Poirot moving slowly, his eyes flicking from panel to portrait, from carpet to skirting board. He paused at the threshold, glancing up at the chandelier, then down at the faint discoloration in the carpet, where the port glass had spilled. "You sat here, Hastings?" he asked, gesturing to a seat. "I did." "And Sir Alistair here?" "Yes, just there." He made the toast, then collapsed. Poirot bent, brushing a hand across the carpet. He sniffed his fingers, frowned, then looked to the sideboard. "There are 7 glasses," he said. "But there were 8 at dinner, no?" "Yes, of course. 1 for each guest." He looked to Kersey, who had just entered. "The 8th glass." "It was removed, sir," the butler said. After the incident." Poirot nodded slowly. "And cleaned?" "Yes, sir. As per routine." He turned to me. "It is always the routine that conceals, Hastings, not the chaos." As we left the dining room, Poirot paused beside a large antique mirror in the hallway. He inspected it, not as a vain man might, but with interest, his eyes narrowing on a faint smudge near the bottom corner. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed gently. "Grease," he said softly. "Someone touched this recently, perhaps leaning close. But not for grooming, no. They were hiding, watching." I looked at him, puzzled. Watching what? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the staircase. As we climbed, he noted the pattern in the dust, where footsteps had paused, where one had turned abruptly. Outside Lillian's room, he stopped and looked at the faint scuff mark by the doorframe. "She left her room last night," he said, "but did not want to be seen." "Couldn't it have been a maid?" I asked. Poirot shook his head. "No. The heel is narrow, female, yes, but a lady's shoe, not a servant's." We were interrupted by Mrs. Crane descending the stairs with a fur stole around her shoulders and a pleasant smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Such a dreadful shock," she said. "Sir Alistair was so vivid. One never imagines they'll go in silence." Poirot gave her a polite bow. "And yet, madame, silence is the one visitor none of us can bar." She laughed lightly, though her gaze darted briefly to the drawing room. "I'm afraid I must retire. All this tragedy, it makes one quite weary." "Indeed," Poirot said, watching her retreat with faint interest. "She is tired, yes, but not from grief." As we returned to the morning room, Poirot paused once more by the sideboard. He ran his fingers along its edge, then looked at me. "Hastings," he said softly, "do you recall what I told you? When the cause is invisible, the motive must shout." "Yes." "You believe this was murder, then?" He smiled gently. "I believe it was not chance, but motive, Hastings. Motive is a flower that must be coaxed. It opens only when one has been most patient." He picked up the folded Times from the table, flipped it open to the back page, then narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" I asked. He folded it again and laid it down. "Merely something curious." But he did not elaborate. Later that evening, as the house fell into a strained hush and I retired to write in my notebook, I caught sight of Poirot through the half-open door. He stood at the window, looking out at the darkened garden, arms folded neatly, head tilted ever so slightly. Not thinking. Watching. Whatever he had seen that day, be it a smudge, a scent, or a silence, had already begun to form a picture, and someone, somewhere in that house, was unaware that their moment of concealment had already failed. Poirot chose to begin the morning methodically, much like a man laying out chess pieces before the game begins. After breakfast, taken alone by preference, he summoned each member of the household in turn, not with the dramatic air of interrogation, but rather like a courteous guest requesting conversation. The setting was the drawing room, where light fell in long bars through tall windows, and the scent of lemon oil lingered from the polished furniture. I remained nearby, notebook in hand, though more often I found myself observing than writing. Lady Evelyn came first. She wore a shade of grey that flattered her complexion and conveyed the appropriate decorum. Her eyes were damp, but her tone, remained composed. "He was not an easy man, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, folding and unfolding a handkerchief. "But he had his principles. He was proud of the estate, proud of tradition. He liked things done properly." "Bien sûr," Poirot replied gently. "And the evening of his death, he made no mention of being unwell?" "None." She hesitated. "He seemed in better spirits than usual, oddly enough. Toasted us all, laughed even, perhaps—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I had the sense he was trying to make peace, with something." Poirot tilted his head. "Peace with something? Or someone?" Lady Evelyn did not answer at once. There were matters that weighed on him. Our children, his past, and his will, perhaps. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "A document of many emotions, n'est-ce pas?" He watched her as she blinked once, slowly, then nodded. Next came Marcus, bristling with unspent irritation. He sat with his arms crossed, a posture that spoke volumes even before he uttered a word. "This is all unnecessary," he said. "The doctor gave his opinion. Why go rummaging through grief like it's a tax record?" Poirot smiled calmly. "Forgive me, Monsieur Marcus. I do not rummage, I observe." "Observe all you like," he said, shrugging. "I was with everyone at dinner. I had nothing to gain by my father dying suddenly." "On the contrary," Poirot said, eyes twinkling, "you stand to gain a great deal, if I understand correctly." Marcus's jaw tightened. "My father changed his will 3 months ago. I'm not the primary heir." "Indeed?" Poirot leaned slightly forward. "And do you know who is?" "No," Marcus snapped. "He didn't say, but he made it clear. He was disappointed in me." Poirot's expression didn't shift. "And that did not trouble you?" "Of course it did," Marcus said, the words coming more quickly now. "He wanted me to live by his rules, by his image. But I'm not him." "I never was." He stood to leave, but Poirot stopped him with a final, seemingly idle remark. "And you recall what he said in his toast, yes?" Marcus paused. "To enduring names and enduring houses." "Something like that." Poirot nodded. "Merci. Monsieur, that may prove more revealing than you think." Lillian arrived next. She moved delicately, almost silently, and seemed not so much evasive as detached, her gaze trailing to corners of the room rather than meeting Poirot's eyes. "You were fond of your father, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked. "He was difficult," she said after a pause, "but he meant well, I think." "You looked away when he toasted the family," Poirot said quietly. "I didn't hear it." "You were seated directly across from him." She flinched, barely perceptibly. "Perhaps I was distracted." "By Monsieur Sims?" he asked lightly. She looked up sharply, then composed herself. "He's been helpful since I returned to Greystone. I've had difficulty adjusting." Poirot's tone was still gentle. "You returned recently?" 10 weeks ago," she said. "After living abroad, father asked me back. He said it was time I came home." Poirot gave a small, thoughtful nod. "And did you find it? Home?" Lillian's silence lasted longer than necessary. "I suppose I tried. When she left, I could not help whispering, 'Do you think she's hiding something?'" Poirot raised a brow. "She is hiding many things, Hastings, but which one matters most we have yet to learn." Then came Mr. Sims. He entered briskly, hair neatly parted, his spectacles perched just so. He carried a leather folio, though Poirot never asked to see it. "You've been Sir Alister's secretary for how long?" Poirot began. 18 months, Sims replied. "I handled appointments, correspondence, estate records. I was trusted, I believe." "And what did he trust you with last?" Sims hesitated. "He dictated a letter to a solicitor concerning amendments to a trust. I hadn't yet typed the final draft." "Was this shortly before his death?" "Yes, the afternoon of the day itself." "And you were at dinner, of course?" "I served the wine, actually. We were short-staffed, so I offered. Sir Alister preferred to be served from the decanter directly." Poirot's eyes flicked sideways. "How kind of you. Tell me, did you observe anything odd at the table?" Sims cleared his throat. "Lady Evelyn barely ate. Miss Lillian didn't drink. And Sir Alister, well, he seemed reflective. He kept looking at the painting above the hearth. The shepherd's warning." Poirot said. Curious choice for a dining room. Sims offered a faint smile. He said it reminded him of what happens when people ignore signs. Poirot remained silent for a long moment. Mrs. Crane arrived last. Poised, elegant, a scent of gardenia trailing behind her. She settled in with ease, folding her hands delicately. I had known Alistair in younger days, she began, voice touched with nostalgia. He was a friend to my late husband. We drifted apart, of course, but I believe he had regrets. About many things. Regret is the luxury of the living, Poirot replied. Did he speak to you about such things? He alluded to them, the choices he'd made, particularly regarding Lillian. I think he wished to reconcile. And did he? Poirot asked. Mrs. Crane smiled. You'd have to ask Lillian, though I suspect too much had passed. You mentioned to Lady Evelyn, Poirot said, that you and Sir Alistair spoke on Thursday afternoon. Yet you were seen walking with Professor Carrow then. She blinked. No, Thursday morning. We spoke before the others arrived. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Forgive me, I must have misunderstood. When she left, Poirot turned to me. The lies are gentle, Hastings, but they are lies nonetheless. It was just before luncheon when a young housemaid, Edna, knocked hesitantly. Poirot welcomed her kindly. I didn't want to say anything before, she whispered, but I saw Sir Alistair. He was arguing the day before he died. Arguing with whom? Poirot asked. She bit her lip. I'm not sure, I only heard voices. One was his, the other muffled but angry. Where did this happen? In the library, around 4. He slammed the door after. Poirot nodded solemnly. You did well to speak. When she had gone, he walked to the sideboard and retrieved the port decanter. He held it to the light, turned it, then set it back with a curious look. Hastings, he said softly. Sometimes the absence of a fingerprint speaks more loudly than its presence. He walked away before I could ask what he meant, but I noted the soft hook in his words, and I knew he had seen something no one else had. Again, it was well past 3 when Poirot requested access to Sir Alistair's study, a room that had been kept locked since the evening of his death. Kersey, the butler, handed over the brass key without comment, though I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he placed it into Poirot's palm. Whether from age or something else, I could not say. The door swung open on stiff hinges, revealing a room far less grand than the rest of the house, wood-panelled, orderly and distinctly private. A heavy desk occupied the centre, flanked by high-backed chairs and a wall of volumes arranged with military precision. Poirot paused just inside the threshold, taking a long moment to survey the space in silence. His eyes moved from the small hearth to the bookshelf, then settled on a waste-bin, its contents undisturbed. He stepped forward slowly, as though the floor itself might whisper something forgotten. It is a room of the head, not the heart, he murmured. A place for thought, control, secrets. He moved to the desk, examining its contents without disturbing them. Papers, neatly stacked, a silver inkwell, half full, a blotter, unused. He picked up a sealed envelope that lay off to one side, addressed, but unsent. He held it gently between thumb and forefinger, lifted it toward his nose and stopped. Ah, he said softly. Voilà. What is it? I asked, leaning in. He turned the envelope slightly, eyes narrowing. A scent, faint but distinct. Do you smell it, Hastings? I took it, sniffed and blinked. Floral, but not like perfume. Almost medicinal? Poirot nodded. Oleander. The name meant little to me at first, but Poirot's tone gave it weight. It is a plant, he explained. Beautiful, decorative and very deadly. Every part of it, leaf, flower, root, is toxic, a favorite of certain ancient civilizations for its silent effect. I frowned. But the doctor said there was no trace of poison. Poirot held up a finger. Justament. No trace in the blood, the stomach, or the organs. That is what is curious. If oleander was the method, it was not used in the traditional sense. He laid the envelope down with care, then crossed to the bookcase. Observe, Hastings, do you see any volumes out of place? I shook my head. They all look like they've stood there for years. Poirot touched one spine gently, then another. Finally, he pulled a small monograph from the far end. It concerned Mediterranean flora. Inside, between the pages, was a dried, pressed flower. Its petals faded but distinct. Not from the garden, he said, studying it. Not at this time of year, and not native to England. Then someone brought it here. We, and kept it. Why? He closed the book carefully. A token, a tool. The question hung in the air. We returned to the desk, where Poirot studied the positioning of objects with unusual intensity. He crouched beside the chair, examining the edge of the carpet, then the underside of the blotter. He touched the leather with the back of his hand, then peered beneath it. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "do you notice anything peculiar about this desk?" I scanned it, unsure. "It's very symmetrical. Exactament. And yet—" He pointed to the far corner where a small paperweight had left a faint ring. "It has been moved recently, and here, see the scratches beneath the lamp? Someone was here before us." "Sims, perhaps?" I offered. "Perhaps. But the secretary is always watched. No, I think this was done quietly, discreetly." We were interrupted by a soft knock. Kersey entered with a message. "Mrs. Crane requests a moment with you, sir, in the library." Poirot thanked him and returned his gaze to the envelope. "Tell her we will come shortly." When Kersey left, Poirot turned to me. "You remember, Hastings, the argument the maid overheard in the library?" "Yes, around 4 the day before the death. And now Mrs. Crane chooses the same room at a similar hour. Curious." We descended in silence. The library, dim and quiet, smelled of dust and leather. Mrs. Crane stood by the window, turning the tassel of the curtain absently between her fingers. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said, smiling faintly. "I had hoped for a private word." Poirot nodded. "We are alone, madame." She glanced toward me, then back. "I wanted to clarify something I said about Thursday. I realize now I must have been mistaken. Sir Alistair and I spoke on Wednesday, not Thursday." Poirot regarded her evenly. "That is quite a specific memory to shift." Her smile tightened. "Time blurs when one is grieving." "Of course." Poirot stepped closer. "And yet you were quite sure before. You even recalled the position of the sun on the lawn." She hesitated. Perhaps I was trying to be helpful. I didn't wish to seem uncooperative." Poirot's tone remained gentle. "Madame, it is not uncooperative to be truthful. It is dangerous to be otherwise." There was a long pause. Mrs. Crane let the tassel drop. "He was angry," she said at last. "That's what I didn't want to say. He accused me of influencing Lillian, of turning her against him. It was absurd, but he was not himself." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci. That is most enlightening. When we left, I turned to him at once." "So she was the one arguing with him?" "She admits to it, yes, but under pressure. We must consider, did she admit it to disarm suspicion, or because she fears someone else will reveal it?" Back in the study, Poirot took out his notebook and began writing in a small, precise hand. I watched the pencil move as though he were drawing not a list but a map. He paused once, looked up and said, "Oleander, Hastings, a beautiful thing that kills quietly, invisibly, much like a lie told by someone you trust. Do you think it was in the port?" I asked. "No," he said. "The doctor would have found it. But there are other ways." "Then how?" He smiled faintly. "That, my friend, is what we must uncover." He reached again for the envelope with the faint floral scent and turned it gently in his hand. Then carefully he slid it into his coat. "Let us see," he murmured, "if this flower was a flourish or a signature." And with that, he closed the desk drawer, the soft click sounding far louder than it should have. Poirot spent much of the following morning in quiet movement, drifting from room to room with an air of polite distraction that was anything but. He had asked for no further interviews, and yet he spoke briefly with nearly everyone. A word here, a remark there, always seemingly inconsequential, always courteous. But I saw it. The way Lady Evelyn blinked too slowly when he mentioned a sealed envelope. How Marcus flinched almost imperceptibly at the word debt. How Lillian, seated near the drawing-room fire, grew suddenly cold when he mentioned a name I had never heard before, and so the tapestry began to unravel, not in shouts or accusations, but in frayed threads that Poirot pulled gently, one after another. He began with Marcus, who had retreated to the billiard room, striking cue balls with unnecessary force. Poirot leaned against the doorframe, arms folded neatly. "You play to distract yourself, monsieur?" Marcus didn't look up. "From what?" "From the questions you do not wish to ask yourself." Marcus lined up another shot, missed it entirely, and stepped back with a sigh. "Look, I told you, yes, I had disagreements with my father. Who didn't? Disagreements are common. But financial entanglements? That is more delicate." There was a pause. "What do you want to know?" "You owe money, substantial money, enough to require the sale of land. A sale your father would not permit." Marcus laughed without humor. "Of course he wouldn't. He said selling land was like selling your spine. Said I had no stomach for the future, only hunger for the present." And was he wrong? I never got the chance to prove otherwise. He looked up, and for a moment there was something raw in his eyes. He held everything over me. Every penny, every approval. I thought he'd never die. Poirot was silent a moment, then said, "And when he did, you did not know whether to mourn or breathe." Marcus said nothing. Outside in the corridor, Poirot paused by the great-grandfather clock, then adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "Guilt, Hastings," he murmured. "It shows itself in anger, in stillness, and sometimes in billiards." Next came Lady Evelyn, found writing a letter at the escritoire in her room, her hand composed but her shoulders tight. She rose at his approach, smoothing her sleeve, though Poirot did not sit. "Correspondence, madam?" he asked gently. "Just a note to my sister," she replied, folding the paper without sealing it. "To inform her of the arrangements." Poirot inclined his head. "And your own arrangements, madam? Do they require letters too?" She stilled. "I beg your pardon?" "Letters," he repeated softly. "Private ones. Perhaps from someone to whom your husband would not have wished you to write." Her eyes flashed once before she looked away. "He read one. I'm not sure how he found it. It wasn't improper exactly, but not something he'd forgive easily." "And when did he find it?" 3 nights before he died." Poirot said nothing, only nodded. She looked at him then, squarely, bravely. "You think I had something to do with it? I think a man like Sir Alistair does not die without the shadow of something beneath him, and those shadows often begin with secrets, especially secrets kept from one's spouse." She folded the letter with perfect calm. "If you mean to accuse me, Monsieur Poirot, I suggest you say it plainly." "But I do not accuse, madame," he said, his voice smooth. "I observe." And he left her standing there, expression unreadable, but her hand clenched just slightly around the paper. In the library, Lillian was seated by the window again, tracing the lines of the glass with one pale finger. Poirot took the seat opposite her, not asking permission. "Miss Lillian," he said gently, "your father brought you home after years apart. That is a gesture of great weight. And yet there is no warmth in the return." She did not look at him. "It wasn't warmth he offered. It was access. He changed the will. I saw the new draft. I was back in. He said he wanted to restore what had been lost." Poirot tilted his head. "And was it lost or taken?" Lillian's lips twitched faintly. "He disinherited me after I married, said I had thrown the family's name to wolves. He never forgave me, not until recently." "And your husband?" "Gone," she said shortly. "Died in Lisbon. 3 years ago, left me nothing but debts." Poirot let the silence linger. "And yet your father asked you back, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from fear," he asked. "I came. And now he's dead. Make of that what you will." Poirot studied her for a moment. "Tell me, did he ever speak of regret?" She shook her head. "He didn't speak. He controlled. He amended his will like some people prune roses, violently." Poirot stood. "Merci, mademoiselle. It was in the conservatory that we found Mrs. Crane, seated among the orchids, a book, resting on her lap but clearly unread. She greeted Poirot with her usual poise, gesturing to the seat beside her. "You look thoughtful," she said. I am always thoughtful, Poirot replied, especially when the past knocks on the present. Oh, she gave a soft laugh. We all have a past, Monsieur Poirot. But mine was quite dull, I'm afraid. Dull, perhaps, he said. Except for one name. She turned her head slightly. Which name would that be? Rupert Malling. She flinched, barely, but it was enough. I see. You've done your reading. He was a colleague of your husband's, was he not? And later, a man ruined by Sir Alister's testimony during a scandal with the Trade Board. He took his own life 2 years later, she said quietly. And yes, he was someone I cared for, before I married. And Sir Alister knew. This? She nodded slowly. I suspect he did. He never said so, but he had a way of punishing without announcing it. And yet you accepted his invitation. She gave him a brittle smile. Forgiveness is an attractive fiction, even more so when you're lonely. Poirot stood. You are not dull, madame, not in the least. Later, as we walked along the east corridor, Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Each of them, Hastings, each carries something unresolved. And it is always in the past that the key lies hidden, like a single crack beneath a polished mirror. I looked at him. So you've made up your mind? None. Not yet. But I am watching the mirror, and I am watching who avoids it. At that moment, Kersey appeared with a small note. Poirot opened it, read it, and tucked it silently into his waistcoat. What is it? I asked. He looked ahead, toward the stair. It is the beginning of the end of lies. And he said no more. The next thread unravelled in the most mundane of places, the conservatory. It was Kersey who found it, during his usual mid-morning check of the house's common rooms. He had intended only to air the windows, but his eye had caught the glint of something metallic behind a low potted palm, a cylindrical glass container, narrow, stoppered, and labelled with a thin strip of tape on which the word Nerium was printed in fading ink. The item was brought promptly to Poirot, who examined it without touching the stopper. He raised one eyebrow, then asked softly, "And where, Kersey, did this come from?" "Behind the potted oleander, sir, in the conservatory, near where Professor Caro was keeping his specimens, if I may say." Poirot nodded. "Mercy, you have the instincts of a good gardener and an even better detective." He turned to me. "Come, Hastings, let us not keep the good professor waiting." Professor Ewan Caro was in the breakfast room, sipping a cup of tepid tea and perusing the previous day's Times with an expression of vaguely exaggerated boredom. Poirot entered with the container in hand, holding it as one might a candle, upright, reverent, but alert. Caro looked up and gave a low whistle. "Well now, that's one of mine. I say, where did you come across it?" "In the conservatory. Not in the locked case where your other samples are kept." Caro frowned, set the paper aside and rose. "Impossible. I accounted for each specimen yesterday. They were all secure." "Then this one has made a bid for independence?" Poirot asked mildly. The professor approached, took the vial in, his broad calloused hands, and examined the seal. "It hasn't been tampered with. I'd stake my career on it. Still sealed, as you see. Label intact. Oleander leaf submerged in alcohol. Entirely safe when kept like this." Poirot nodded, but his gaze lingered. "And yet the scent of oleander has been detected elsewhere in the house, not in the conservatory." Caro looked surprised. "You mean in the study?" "Among other places. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I take great care. I'm not in the habit of poisoning my hosts." "No," Poirot said softly. "But someone else may be, and they may not need to steal from you directly if you've already brought the weapon into the house." Caro bristled. "That's rather unfair." "Isn't it?" "I informed Sir Alister I'd be bringing botanical samples. He was fascinated by toxicology. We had a lengthy discussion over port just 2 nights before he died. And did he express interest in oleander in particular?" Caro hesitated. "He asked which poisons left no trace. I assumed it was idle curiosity." "Curiosity," Poirot echoed. "It is a plant with roots both benign and deadly." The professor gave a tired chuckle. "Yes, well, so are most of us." After Caro had left the room, Poirot turned to me with that expression of tempered amusement he wore. when the pieces were not quite falling where others believed they should. He is too obvious, Hastings. Too composed. A man who speaks so freely of poison is not the one who uses it. But the sample was there, unguarded, I said. It's not impossible someone took it. Not impossible, Poirot said. But if so, the professor would hardly have left it where it might incriminate him, no? A poisoner does not flaunt his tools. There was another consideration, the label. Poirot returned to the conservatory and examined the remaining cases. Each container bore the same careful tape and Latin names, lined up like museum artifacts. The missing one, now returned, fit neatly into a third-row slot, undisturbed until now. Who had access, I asked. Everyone, Poirot replied. No lock, no surveillance. The house has not the staff for such caution. But who knew? What it was, he didn't answer. He was studying the potted palms again, kneeling beside the planter where the vial had been discovered. He sniffed the leaves, leaned forward, and smiled faintly. There is a trail, Hastings. Not of scent, but of carelessness. Someone handled this plant recently. Someone who left no tool marks but disturbed the soil. A knock at the glass caught our attention. Lillian stood just outside the conservatory door, pale as usual but her expression tense. "May I speak with you, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. "Privately." He opened the door and gestured for her to join us. "It's about the will," she said softly. "I thought perhaps I should tell you there was a clause. It wasn't in the original version, but Father added it. A conditional clause." Poirot leaned forward. "Go on, mademoiselle." "If I was unmarried at the time of his death and the estate would pass to me." "Ah," Poirot said. "And were you?" She swallowed. "Yes, but I hadn't told him, not until the night before." "Not told him you were? I married." Again quietly, in France. I'd planned to tell him eventually, but then he changed the will, and I thought if he knew he'd undo it. And when he learned, she looked away. He was furious. Poirot's gaze remained steady. "And you regret telling him?" She did not answer. When she had gone, I looked at Poirot. "That gives her motive." "It gives many people motive," he said. "But this is emotion. We must distinguish between rage and calculation." Later that afternoon, the household was visibly altered. The word had spread about Caro's specimen. Marcus spoke louder than necessary at tea, proclaiming that things were finally making sense. Lady Evelyn, for once, looked almost relieved. Mrs. Crane asked if it might be best to call the matter concluded. Only Sims remained quiet, his eyes darting between guests like a man trying to hear what he already suspected. Poirot, meanwhile, said very little. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching the drawing-room like one observing a play unfold. That evening, as we prepared to retire, I remarked, "Well, you must admit, Caro makes a likely suspect." Poirot nodded. "He is likely, yes. That is the problem." "You don't believe he's guilty?" Poirot smiled faintly. "My friend, guilty men do not leave their fingerprints on the murder weapon, nor do they label it in Latin." He rose, reached into his waistcoat, and retrieved the envelope from the study, the one that had borne the floral scent. "And besides," he said quietly, "our poisoner had no need of samples. The scent of oleander was already here, and it was not the professor who sealed this letter." He tucked it away and turned to the window. "There is still one person," he added, "who lies too little. That is what troubles me." He said no more that night, but I noted the tension at his jaw, the way he stood in the half-darkness listening, not to the wind, but to the house itself. Somewhere, behind those quiet walls, the final piece was waiting. And Poirot, ever patient, had begun to reach for it. It was just after midday when Poirot requested Kersey to fetch Mr. Sims for a quiet word in the study. The house, though formally composed, carried a low thrum of anticipation. Since the business with the misplaced oleander sample, a certain tension had embedded itself in the very walls. Guests spoke in subdued tones. Teacups clinked just a little more softly. Everyone, it seemed, hoped the worst had been found. Hoped, too, that the foreign man with the pointed shoes and sharp eyes had finished his work. But Poirot was not finished. He was only now beginning to draw the noose tighter. Sims entered with a folder tucked beneath his arm, and an expectant look that faltered ever so slightly upon seeing me present. Poirot gestured for him to sit. He did so, clutching the folder like a schoolboy awaiting reprimand. "Tell me, Monsieur Sims," Poirot began lightly, "have you worked in other households before this one?" "Yes, sir. 1 or 2 estates over the years. Before here, I was in Norfolk, with the Winthrop family." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, and before that?" A pause. "A smaller house." "In Surrey, not a long post." "No?" Poirot tilted his head. "Forgive me. Would that house have been Ashcombe Manor?" Sims's face did not change in any dramatic way. He simply stilled, the air of deference replaced by something colder. "I don't recall mentioning that name." "You did not," said Poirot softly. "But I have a memory for such things. The head housekeeper there remembered you, only she did not remember a Mr. Sims." Sims's lips thinned. "May I ask the purpose of this line of questioning?" "May we? The purpose, Monsieur Beck, or Sims, is to understand why a man, dismissed for theft under a different name, now appears at Greystone Hall with access to Sir Alistair's most confidential documents." I watched as the colour left Sims's face entirely. "You've no proof," he said, barely above a whisper. "Proof?" Poirot echoed. "Let us not worry about proof, pour l'instant. Let us instead consider the facts. Forged correspondence, found among Sir Alistair's personal papers. Letters written in his name but not his hand. Letters suggesting new financial arrangements, new beneficiaries, all created using the house typewriter, a machine to which I believe only you had regular access." "I did nothing harmful," Sims Beck said suddenly. "They were drafts, none were sent. He had such rigid views, he would never listen. He believed in control over compassion. I was trying to correct injustice." "By forging legal documents?" I asked, aghast. He ignored me, speaking only to Poirot now. He didn't deserve that power. He didn't understand what he held. There were people in this house, Miss Lillian especially, who deserved better. Poirot's voice remained calm. "And did you see yourself as the one to decide who deserved what?" Sims sat back, defeated. "I was trying to help." Poirot nodded slowly. "But you were not trying to kill, that much I believe." From the doorway a sound. Lillian stood half-shadowed in the corridor, her hand on the frame. I had not seen her arrive, nor, judging by the look on Sims's face, had he. She stepped into the room. "It's true then," she said quietly. "You lied." Sims rose, startled. "Lillian, I—" "Don't," she said. "You lied to me. To everyone. All that time I thought—" He tried to step toward her, but she shook her head and turned away. Poirot, unmoving, merely watched the interaction unfold. When Sims attempted again to speak, Poirot raised a hand. "I think, Monsieur Beck," he said, "you have said enough for one afternoon." Sims turned and left without another word. Lillian lingered a moment longer before following silently, her face unreadable. I exhaled. "You really believe he didn't kill Sir Alistair?" "He had the means for fraud, not murder," Poirot replied. "He was too clever to be careless, and a man who seeks to reshape justice does not extinguish it entirely." "But he could have," I insisted. "He could have feared exposure, Alistair confronting him." "That might have tipped the scales." Poirot shook his head. "Non-Hastings. If he feared discovery, he would have run. Instead, he stayed and observed until someone else panicked." We were interrupted again, this time by Marcus, entering. Without a knock, his usual swagger was tempered by agitation. "I just heard," he said. "Sims? He's not who he said he was?" Poirot didn't answer. Marcus paced briefly. "You think he did it, don't you?" "No," Poirot said. "I think someone is very relieved you believe that." Marcus stopped pacing. Poirot continued. "Your father was aware of the fraud, Monsieur Marcus. He had made inquiries. He had not yet acted, but he suspected. Perhaps he even confronted Sims, but then he did not tell the police. Why?" Marcus looked caught off guard. "I don't know. Maybe he wanted to deal with it privately." "Perhaps. But now he is dead. And Monsieur Sims, he is not the one who gained from that death." "But someone else did. Someone who wanted those documents hidden, destroyed, or used." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "And you think that someone was me?" Poirot gave a small shrug. "Je ne dis rien. I only ask, why were you in the study Day before the death? I wasn't. Ah, but you were seen. Marcus's jaw twitched. All right. I was there. I came looking for something, papers. I thought he was out, but he caught me and we argued. Is that what you wanted to hear? Poirot said nothing, which always seemed to say the most. Marcus glanced toward the hallway. This place is a damn pressure cooker. I hope you get what you're looking for. After he had gone, I turned to Poirot. Well, that certainly sounds suspicious. Oui. And it would be more so if I believed him capable of planning. You think someone else used the fraud to their advantage? Poirot gave a small nod. That is what I begin to suspect. Monsieur Beck created a web, but someone else used it to strangle. He opened a small envelope on the desk, one retrieved from the bin in the study. It was torn but legible. A signature at the bottom read A. Hemmings, though Poirot tapped the shape of the letters gently. This is not his hand, he said softly, but someone practiced to make it look so. Badly, but not carelessly. And if one can forge a letter... He trailed off, eyes narrowing. What? I prompted. Poirot smiled faintly. Forgive me, mon ami, but the mirror, the polished mirror, has just begun to crack. He placed the torn letter back inside his coat and rose. There is one more. Farum I must see. And one person who has said far too little. He said nothing further, but I knew by the stillness of his step and the sudden coldness in his tone. The killer was not far now, and someone, somewhere in this house, had begun. To understand that Hercule Poirot was no longer asking questions, he was answering them. It was Kersey who discovered the empty room. Lady Evelyn's door stood ajar in the early morning light, her bed untouched, her dressing gown missing from the hook. A maid's shriek brought the household from slumber with alarming speed. Poirot and I were already downstairs, breakfast untouched, when the news reached us. The torn letter was found on her vanity, ripped in haste and left in fragments that Poirot collected gently, piecing together the sentences like clues themselves. It was not a confession. Not quite. Nor was it a farewell. I thought it was only lies, one line read, but now I think it was always the truth and I cannot stay to face it. Hastings, ever direct, said what most were thinking. She's run, Poirot. She feared you would uncover her affair or worse, and she's fled the consequences. Poirot made no reply. He moved slowly about the room, touching the edges of the torn stationery, noting the absence of her jewelry box and the opened wardrobe. Then he stepped back, eyes narrowing. Non-Hastings, this is not flight, it is retreat. And retreat is not cowardice, it is calculation. We descended to the drawing-room where the air still held the faint perfume of dust and roses. Poirot paced the perimeter, pausing now and then at nothing at all. Then, just as I began to speak, he held up one hand, stooped, and drew aside the heavy drape nearest the fireplace. Behind it, on the windowsill, sat a single wine-glass, its rim dulled, slightly with dust, but not yet marked by time. He picked it up with a handkerchief, held it to the light, and turned it slowly. 8 glasses were served, he said. 7 were cleared. 1 was forgotten. Do you think it was hers? I asked. Poirot turned it again. Possibly. But more important, why hide it? And who hid it? He moved to the writing desk, selected a vial from his pocket, and poured a drop into the glass. The clear liquid remained unchanged. He sniffed and then nodded. There is no poison in the wine, not ingested, no, but something was present. Something else. He set the glass down and walked to the sideboard, where he picked up a linen napkin and unfolded it with care. At its corner, faint and discolored, was a residue, barely visible. He touched it, sniffed and nodded again. It is not what he drank, Hastings, he said softly. It is what he touched. And suddenly everything shifted. We walked to the dining room once more. Poirot stood at Sir Alistair's chair and pointed to the armrest. There, see the lacquer. I leaned in, a dull spot, subtle but clearly there. He turned to me, eyes gleaming now. Oleander is fat-soluble, mon ami. Mixed in oil, applied to wood, when touched by skin and combined with alcohol, it enters the bloodstream almost invisibly. No ingestion, no visible trace. And the wineglass, I asked? Removed quickly, hidden before the servants could clean it. Someone realized what they had done, or what might be found. He grew silent again, deep in thought. In the corridor, murmurs spread quickly of Lady Evelyn's disappearance. Marcus paced the hall like a man about to be condemned or crowned. Lillian refused to leave her room. Mrs. Crane sat in the library, paging through a novel she clearly wasn't reading. Caro, for once, was nowhere to be found. It was Sims, or rather Beck, who approached us by the stairs, pale and visibly shaken. "I didn't think she'd run," he said, voice hoarse. "I thought she'd stand and deny everything. But to disappear, you assume she has run because she is guilty?" Poirot asked gently. Beck nodded. "Of course. Why else?" Poirot studied him. "There is always another possibility, Monsieur Beck." Beck blinked. "You don't think she was taken?" Poirot did not answer. Later that afternoon I found him alone in the conservatory, gazing not at the plants but at his reflection in the glass. The sun was lowering, and long shadows crept across the floor. "She knew something," he said at last. "Something recent. She was not part of the killing, but she saw a piece of it. A small vital movement, a lie told in haste, a glass moved too soon, a scent that did not belong." "Then why run?" I asked. "Because, Hastings, she knew that knowing without acting is nearly the same as guilt. And perhaps she thought herself next." We found Kersey just outside the garage, lighting a pipe with unsteady fingers. Poirot asked a simple question. "Did Lady Evelyn request the car last night?" The butler frowned. "No, sir. Not through me." "And no sign she left through the front?" "None, but the side gate was unlatched this morning. Leads through the orchard path, hard to spot in the dark." Poirot nodded. "She slipped out without calling attention. Not panicked. Careful." We walked the path later that evening, Poirot leading with deliberate steps. In the half-light, the orchard was quiet save for the rustle of birds settling. At the far end, just before the hedge line, we found it, clear prints in the soft earth. Narrow, healed. Lady Evelyn's. Beside them, larger tracks. Male, leading. Alongside for several paces, and then back the other way. "She was not alone," Poirot said, "but she is again now." When we returned, the household had gathered in tense clusters. Marcus was now openly accusing Beck, who sat silently, hands folded. Lillian stared from across the room but spoke to no one. Mrs. Crane sat beside the fireplace, legs crossed tightly, tapping one shoe on the floor in sharp, rhythmic pulses. Poirot entered without fanfare, stood at the center, and cleared his throat, once. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I will request everyone's presence in the drawing-room. The case is no longer fogged by illusion." He turned and left before anyone could speak. Upstairs in his room he set the hidden wine-glass upon the table and folded his hands beside it. "It was not the wine," he said, more to himself than to me. "It was what lay upon it. A thing unnoticed, untouched by suspicion, until now. And in that moment I realized the game was no longer about motive or history, it was about precision, about method. And Poirot had found his method. The rest, I suspected, would fall like dominoes, the he. Salon was silent. The thick velvet curtains remained drawn despite the late morning sun, casting the room into a kind of dim serenity, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional rustle of fabric as someone shifted in their seat. Poirot stood before the marble hearth, with the ease of a man who had solved the problem long before anyone else realized there was one. He did not speak at once. Instead, he adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate shirt, glanced at the line of seated guests, Marcus, Beck, Mrs. Crane, Professor Caro, and finally Lillian, and let the silence work on them. "I have, mes amis," he said softly, "the honor of explaining not merely how Sir Alistair Hemmings died, but who made it so." No one spoke. Not even Marcus, Poirot continued. "The death, as you know, was swift, quiet, and without visible cause. The good doctor found no trauma, no ingested poison, no foul air, and yet he died. And I, Hercule Poirot, say to you now, he was murdered." A sharp intake of breath came from Mrs. Crane. Caro shifted in his seat, blinking rapidly. Marcus scoffed under his breath, but said nothing. "The method," Poirot said, "was subtle, Brilliant, and nearly undetectable. A poison, yes, but not swallowed. It was absorbed, through the skin, on the very night of his death. He walked slowly toward the sideboard, where a single port glass sat, untouched since the night of the dinner. This glass, he said, lifting it carefully with a handkerchief, was hidden after the meal, behind the curtain, removed from the table and never cleaned. He turned to the group. Why? Because it held a trace, not of the poison itself, but of what carried it. An oil, fat-soluble, mixed with the crushed essence of oleander, applied not to the drink, but to the rim. I watched the reaction ripple. Caro looked stunned. Mrs. Crane raised a gloved hand to her mouth. Beck paled. Lillian remained still. Sir Alistair, after making his toast, drank from the glass. His lips touched the rim. And then, Poirot held up a folded monogrammed handkerchief. He wiped his mouth with this, a cloth laced faintly with perfume, alcohol-based, the final ingredient. The oil, activated, passed through his skin into his bloodstream. Dear God, muttered Caro, and it left no trace. Precisely, said Poirot, a method of murder that speaks not of violence but of thought, precision, knowledge and motive. He let that last word hang in the air a moment. Motive, he repeated, walking to the centre of the room again. Who among you had reason to wish Sir Alistair dead? Who stood to gain? We have examined many suspects. The son, debts and resentment. The widow, guilt and exposure. The secretary, fraud and fear. The botanist, access to poison. He turned now to the fireplace and folded his hands. But none of them, none, had both the means and the presence of mind to plan this so carefully, so deliberately. He looked up slowly. Only one person had the motive. Rage at being written out of the will, then reinstated, then manipulated again like a pawn. Only one person had the opportunity, present at the table, close to the glass, and familiar enough with the household to clean up quickly. Only one person, when I asked about the faint scent of flowers that night, claimed not to smell anything at all when the oleander was present. He turned at last. Mademoiselle Lillian. I felt the room stiffen. All eyes turned to her. She did not flinch. You, Poirot said softly, said nothing of flowers. No memory of the floral perfume. No recognition of the scent of oleander, when it was unmistakable. A scent that lingered even after the wineglass was hidden. Everyone else recalled it in passing. You alone denied it. Not because you forgot, but because you had to pretend it wasn't there. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Poirot stepped forward, voice calm but unrelenting. You returned here under the guise of reconciliation, but it was not peace you sought. It was justice, your version of it. Your father disinherited you for a marriage he called disgraceful. You lost everything. Then you lost your husband. When Sir Alistair welcomed you back, it was conditional. Control once again. He changed his will, but dangled the inheritance like a leash. And you saw it, finally, for what it was. A flicker crossed her face. Anger, perhaps, or release. You did not kill him in passion, Poirot said. You waited, you planned. You used the professor's specimens, not directly, but as inspiration. You found oleander already here. You extracted it, prepared it. You watched as your father made his final toast, so sure of his control over everyone. And you smiled, because he never saw it coming. Lillian stood, slowly. Her hands were folded, but her knuckles were white. And why shouldn't I? She said, voice low, tight. He destroyed lives. Mine, Rupert's, my mother's. He buried everything under his legacy and made us beg for scraps. He called it tradition, but it was tyranny. Poirot did not interrupt. I was a ghost in my own life, she said, until I came back, and I made sure he couldn't do it to me again. There was silence, deep and still. Poirot nodded once. I do not defend him, mademoiselle, but you killed with deliberation. And now, justice must come for you too. She didn't resist. She sat down once more, a woman undone not by force but by revelation. When the constable arrived, she went without protest. The rest of us remained in the salon, stunned. Mrs. Crane wept quietly. Marcus poured himself a drink with shaking hands. And Poirot. He stood once more by the fireplace, gazing into the cold grate. I asked him softly, "You knew all along, didn't—" "You?" he smiled faintly. "No, Hastings, I suspected. But it was not until she claimed not to smell the flower that I was certain." And with that he retrieved the torn letter from his pocket, the one Lady Evelyn had left behind. He read a single line aloud. She said, "I thought it was only lies, but now I think it was always the truth." Poirot folded the letter. She had seen something, not the murder, but the motive. And she ran, not from guilt, but from what she feared would come next. He looked to the window. The clouds had parted now, sunlight dusting the sill. "And now, Hastings," he said gently, "the house may breathe again." But in his eyes, I saw something else, not satisfaction, not triumph, only sorrow, quiet, enduring. The house was quiet again, not the hush of suspense nor the stillness of fear, but something heavier, a silence tinged with the weariness of revelation. Lillian had left with the constables just before noon, a coat draped over her shoulders, her hands folded calmly in front of her, as though stepping into consequence were merely the next item on a list she had already memorized. There had been no tears, no protest. She simply looked once over her shoulder at the drawing room she had once called home and walked through the door. Lady Evelyn returned not an hour later. Her arrival was not dramatic, no carriage clattering up the drive, no breathless explanations. She came in through the side door, hat in hand, her expression clear if pale. Poirot met her in the vestibule and took her gloves with the same delicacy he might afford a vase. "I did not run," she said plainly. "I know," Poirot replied. She handed him a folded note. One of many, she explained, found in a desk drawer. She had only recently opened. "He wrote them," she said, "to me, to himself, little reflections. But then I found the forged letters, the ones Sims created. I didn't know what to believe. So I went to see the solicitor. I thought perhaps I would understand the will. But the truth was not in the will." She met his eyes. "It was in the people around it." Poirot inclined his head. "You chose caution over confrontation. That is not cowardice, madame. It is prudence." In the drawing room, the remnants of the previous day still lingered. A folded blanket left on a chair by the fire, an ashtray bearing the remains of a cigarette no one had claimed, the port decanter, half empty, untouched since the fatal night. One by one, the guests began to depart. Professor Caro left first, his lecture notes packed in a brown case he carried with visible relief. Marcus said nothing to anyone as he slipped out through the front, with only a brief nod in our direction. Mrs. Crane took longer to say her farewells, but they rang hollow, each smile brittle as glass. Beck, formerly Sims, remained the longest. He stood beside the study door, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. When Poirot finally addressed him, he offered no apology, no plea. Only a quiet, "I suppose I've no place here now." Poirot merely said, "No, but perhaps elsewhere with honesty you may build one." When all had gone, the house felt curiously wider. The corridors, once thick with suspicion, now stretched open, echoing with a new kind of emptiness. I joined Poirot in the morning room, where he sat comfortably beside the window, a small china cup of tisane balanced on the armrest. "You knew from the beginning it would be her," I said, though I knew better. With Poirot, certainty was always a hard one. He shook his head lightly. "No, I suspected many. But the truth, it arrives only when the puzzle refuses to fit, until one discards a cherished piece." "The wine," I said. "The glass." "Oui, but more than that, the scent, the denial of it. A person can forget many things, but not what everyone else recalls. Unless—" He paused, sipping. "Unless they must lie." I looked out the window. The orchard path was visible from here, narrow, half covered in frost now. So Lady Evelyn's disappearance? She feared being entangled. She knew of the forgeries, but she did not yet know of the murder, and she doubted whom to trust. I nodded slowly. And the method, so clever, it left nothing. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Ah, but you are wrong, mon ami. It left no trace in the body, none, but in the soul, Ah, that is where it always lingers. He placed the cup down and adjusted his tie, the small habitual movement that always followed a closed case. Not satisfaction exactly, but order restored, and for Poirot, that was justice. "You know," I said, "when we first arrived, I thought this place felt still, undisturbed. But it was only sleeping, wasn't it?" Poirot gave a small, amused nod. Greystone Hall, like its master, kept secrets beneath its fine manners. We did not linger. Bags packed, the car summoned, the autumn sun waning behind us, we left Greystone Hall behind. As the house faded from view, I couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness settle in its place. I glanced once more at Poirot, who sat contentedly in the back seat, his gloves folded neatly on his lap. "And now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "we let the world turn once more, slowly, precisely as it should." And with that he closed his eyes. The great Hercule Poirot, case solved, justice served, the final curtain drawn.